Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm carrying on with some discussion about Rupert's Land. So this would be considered part 4 of my series on that. And I'm referring to a book from 1914, The Adventures of England on Hudson Bay, a chronicle of the fur trade in the North. And this is part of that series of books that I've referenced a number of times. So I'm going to refer to a few quotes here, and some of these things that I'm going to point out might not be too comfortable for people to hear, but you know, it has to be said, right? Because you know the parallels apply in some areas and for some people, and so I just want to caution from the experience that was had at the time, you know, and we're talking the 1600s, and this is a time where, you know, these journeys were not always timed very well. They weren't often able to get back home before winter set in, things like that. And so, you know, here we have, you know, crew, and keep in mind that the crew of these ships were literally taken off the streets at the time. These are people who are sailors who never asked to be sailors, and they weren't all that loyal. And so you have, you know, Henry Hudson's sailors, you know, were ragged, underfed, underclothed fellows, ill-fitted for the rigorous climate of the North and unmoved by the glorious aims that, like a star of hope, led Hudson on. They saw no star of hope and felt only hunger and cold and that dislike of the hardships of life, which is the birthright of the weakling. So, you know, here they are, they're stranded. You know, they reach shore safely, you know, and knocked together out of the tarmac and pines and rocks some semblance of winter cabins. Of game there was abundance then, as now, rabbit and deer and grouse, enough to provision an army. And Hudson offered reward for all provisions brought in, but the leaven of rebellion had worked its mischief. The men would not hunt. Probably they did not know how. Certainly none of them had ever before felt such cold as this, cold that left the naked hand sticking to any metal that it touched, that filled the air with frost, fog, and mock suns that set the wet ship's timbers crackling every night like musket shots, that left a lining of hoar frost and snow on the underside of the berth beds, that burst the great pines and fir trees ashore in loud nightly explosions, and set the air whipping in lights of unearthly splendor, that passed them moving and rustling in curtains of blood and fire, being the northern lights. As anyone who has lived in the region knows, the cowardly incompetents should have been up and out hunting and wresting from nature the one means of protection against northern cold, fur clothing. That is the one demand the North makes of man, that he shall fight and strive for mastery. But these whimpering weaklings, convulsed with the poison of self-pity, sat inside shivering over the little pans and braziers of coal, cursing and cursing Hudson. So this brings to mind how a lot of, and again, forgive me, but I can't help but, you know, comment on what I observe. You see a lot of people, you know, complaining, pointing fingers on social media, for example, and certainly in the past, and really just complaining instead of taking things into their own hands. Conversely, I know of many people who are taking things into their own hands. They're talking about gardens. They may be setting up communal kitchens to service meals to those in need right now during this quarantine. There's people who are starting to look at ways, you know, it's spoken of as food sovereignty in the past, ways to help counter and provide and self-provide and come together. And of course, there are a lot of people who don't have the skills. They haven't had to fish or hunt and things like that. And what's going to happen when, you know, they need to be taught? Are they going to be welcomed, or are they going to be shamed and laughed at? These are times where people need to gather their information, gather their experiences together in a circle and start working with each other. Never mind what Canada is or is not doing. Never mind what chief and council are or not doing. What can you do? What can you do with your neighbor? What can you do with your family? It's important to start doing. And just even those small steps will make a difference. You know, this turns out these rebellious crew, the mutiny, their idea of a result that would work for them was another idea that tends to come up. Then a brilliant thought penetrated the wooden brains of the idle and incompetent crew, a thought that still works its poison in like brains of today. Namely, if there were half as many people, there would be twice as much provisions for each. So you do have many Indian bands, chief and council, keeping tight control on membership, trying to bring down the numbers so there'll be more to go around. That's the opposite of what's going to help and work. The larger your numbers, the larger number of you working together, the larger number of you beginning to really grasp that you're part of something much bigger. And it's going to take a lot of hands on deck in order to protect what you have collectively, who you are as nationals of your nations. It's not the time to confine and narrow down so that the meager givings of Canada, for instance, can be, provide for a fewer number of people. Canada's trying to squeeze you to get you to do just that, to kick out your family and friends and all your relations. This is a time to do the opposite, despite the fact that Canada is constraining you in terms of funding. Because if you reduce your numbers, you then act only as an isolated group, then you are confirming you're not part of a nation. You are confirming you're a remnant. And you are setting the stage to be looked at as such, as just a domestic ethnic minority. Whereas coming together and at times having to re-educate, of course, some of your people because they haven't been with you. They haven't learned what they need to know and understand. These are steps forward. These are going positive. Now, Henry Hudson died. They don't really know what happened to him. Some aspects say that, he married into Indigenous nation and that were red-haired descendants, but no one really knows. And this book is saying, however dire, however deep may be repentance, neither undoes the wrong. Hudson had gone to his unknown grave, sent thither by imbeciles who would not work that they might eat, nor strive that they might win, but sat crouching as their prototypes sit, ready to spring at the throat of endeavor. Being frustrated, angry, acting from that perspective, hatred, looking for every opportunity to cast out those that you're upset with. The stage has been set for you to view your own in that way. To rule the ruling family, if you will, in that way, and to attack. This is time, there are a lot of issues to be resolved, of course, but you need to survive these times. You need to overcome this time of conquest. And just pointing out, terminology. This book was, what did I say, 1914 or 1915? We're looking at the year 1660. And certain men that were out there, French fur traders, came back from the region west of Lake Superior, telling wondrous tales of a tribe of Indians they had met, a Cree nation that passed each summer on the salt waters of the Sea of the North. Not First Nation, not, group, but a Cree nation. It's not that long ago. I keep pointing out, of course, when they came back, they said the adventurers lost no time. That winter, they applied for a charter And in May 1670, the charter was granted by King Charles to the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. The ostensible object was to find the Northwest Passage, and to defray the cost of that finding, a monopoly in trade for all time was given. So again, that's what Rupert's Land was about, a monopoly for trade. And it says, you know, the adventurers were not merely merchants and traders. They were courtiers and princes as well. Rupert, a prince of royal blood, he was the cousin of King Charles II at the time, was the first governor. James, Duke of York, afterwards king, was the second. And Lord Churchill, afterwards the Duke of Marlborough, the third. The annual meetings of shareholders in November and the periodic meetings of the governing committee were held at Whitehall or at the Tower or wherever the court chanced to be residing. All shareholders had to take an oath of fidelity and secrecy. Quote, I do swear to be true and faithful to ye company of adventurers. Ye secrets of ye said company I will not disclose, nor trade to your limits of ye said company's charter, so help me God. Oaths of fidelity and bonds were required from all captains, traders, and servants, and there were gifts and such to exchange for that. So how did they then proceed? Trading in the early days was conducted with a ceremony such as kings might have practiced in international treaty. Now remember, they're conducting trade with indigenous nations. Dressed in regimentals with colored velvet capes lined with silk, swords clanking, buglers and drummers rattling a tattoo, the white trader walked out to meet the Indian chief. And then the Indian chief would present, you know, the white man with priceless furs, and they engaged in this diplomacy and this trade. This was a commercial venture. However, recognizing the fact of indigenous nations, with, as has been called elsewhere, you know, the lords of this country, you know, they engaged in that with them in this royal manner, in this ceremonial manner that you know, is required in international trade of the time. So like an international treaty. And it goes on just to describe tally was kept at first with wampum shells or little sticks in terms of the trade, then with bits of lead melted from tea chests and stamped with the initials of the fort. Finally, these devices were supplanted by modern money. And it's common that we suppose the red man was amply able to take care of themselves in the trade. Well, of course, because indigenous nationals have been trading for centuries and thousands of years. They were no stranger to making a deal. Now, time came when House of Orange came to the throne. It was deemed necessary that the company's monopoly, originally granted by the Stuarts, should be confirmed. Nearly all the old shareholders who had been friends of the Stuarts sold out, and in 1697, the year of the disaster related in this last chapter, was when the company applied for an extension of its royal charter by Act of Parliament. The fur buyers of London opposed the application on the grounds that the charter conferred arbitrary powers to which a private company had no right. The company was a mere stock jobbing concern of no benefit to the public. Beaver was sold at an extortionate advance. You know, they bought it for so cheap from indigenous nationals and sold it for so much more. The English claim to a monopoly drove the Indians to the French. The French were going out to the Indians to engage in trade. Nothing was done to carry out the terms of the charter and finding a Northwest Passage. But didn't answer the great question. If the company retired from the bay, who or what was to resist the encroachments of the French? This consideration saved the situation for the adventurers. Their charter was confirmed. So they were given, notwithstanding a change in king, they were continued in their monopoly for trade. And when France and England, there's all sorts of hostilities and wars and things happening around this time. So, but the treaty in 1713 brought the game of war again to a pause and restored Hudson Bay to England. The company received back all its forts on the bay, but the treaty did not define the boundaries to be observed between the fur traders of Quebec pressing north and the fur traders of the bay pressing south. And this unsettled point proved a source of friction in after years. I think it was 1821 when the two companies actually merged. The finding of the passage had been one of the reasons, Northwest Passage, had been one of the reasons for the granting of the charter. And the fur buyers' petition against the charter had set forth that small effort had been made in that direction. They heard from the Indians of rare metals, Northwest, etc. And I can only think, even though weren't found, they're individual opportunists too, right? So Indigenous nationals, drop a little hint about something. Well, you would need me as your guide to take you there, right? So it's no different than you'd find in any period of time where an individual is trying to take advantage of a situation. Now, going back to, this is in 1754, this is talking about, trade coming down Saskatchewan River. Beginning one Anthony Hendry, a boy outlawed from the Isle of Wight for smuggling, was permitted to go back with the Assiniboines from Nelson in June 1754. And it's describing, using Indian place names, the path that he took, etc. And this is up and down the broad current of the Kiskatchewan Seepy, forgive pronunciation, which means swift, angrily flowing waters, now called the Saskatchewan River. It's up and down its broad current from time immemorial. Flitted the war canoes of the Cree like birds of prey to plunder the Blackfeet or horse Indians. Between these high steep banks came the voyageurs of the old fur companies, and up these waters, etc., came traders of the company with the swiftest paddles the West has ever known. Everyone coming back and forth, pretty busy time. And Hendry became the first Englishman to ascend the Saskatchewan. He complained about the mosquitoes. Anyway, he said somewhere between the north and south branches of the Saskatchewan, Hendry's Assiniboines, because he was with them, met Indians on horseback, the Blackfeet. The Blackfeet Indians tell us today that the Assiniboines and Crees used to meet the Blackfeet to exchange the trade of the bay at Wetaskiwin, the Hills of Peace. And it's an interesting comment that Henry was conveyed to the main Blackfeet camp on October 14 of that year. And, he said, my guide informed the leader I was sent by the Grand Leader who lives on the great waters to invite his young men down with their furs. They would receive in return powder, shot, guns, and cloth. He made little answer, the great chief. Said it was far, he made little answer, said it was far off and his people could not paddle. We were then ordered to depart to our tents, which we pitched a quarter of a mile outside their lines. The chief told me his tribe never wanted food as they followed the buffalo. But he was informed the natives who frequented the settlements often starved on their journey, which was exceedingly true. So, the wiseness in looking at these times and how that experience and knowledge applies today. This chief is saying, look, my people, the ones I hear who went into the settlements, they starved, right? Whereas those who stayed within our nation, conducting themselves in accordance with how we survive and how we do things, had no need for food. So it's a good lesson in the sense of, what was conveyed back in 1700s here, to remind what's going to happen to you if you give up your nation and you frequent the settlements. Right now, look at it this way, frequenting the settlements is like being at those tables, being offered the money that comes there. Will you survive, or will you be hungry in the future? I think it's a very important lesson to consider when faced with those decisions. Are you going to stay with your nation, with your community, or are you going to venture into the settlements? And will you indeed starve or not? And that's all I have to say.